Hello, today I am going to be talking about Frans Masereel. I'm not sure how to pronounce his surname, but I think this is it. So, Mr. Frans Masereel was a Belgian graphic artist and printmaker known predominantly for his woodcuts that focused on social and political issues. He often collected them into what he termed wordless novels, creating over 40 woodcut novels, and is regarded as one of the prototypical creators of the modern graphic novel, influencing not only later printmakers and graphic artists, but also a century of comics. This makes me, someone who is only here because of comics, very happy. Disclaimer, I do really, really like this guy's work, so this is going to be a long presentation. Apologies in advance, but I promise it's cool. So, Masereel was born in 1889 in Belgium. His father died when he was 5, and his stepfather was a strong socialist, so as a child he took part in many protests, particularly for the rights of Ghent textile workers. These early experiences of taking action against social inequality formed a dominant theme throughout his later work. He began studying art at the École des Beaux-Arts in Ghent under Jean Delvin, but left after a year, instead travelling to Paris, England and Germany, which inspired his first etchings and woodcuts. Being a pacifist, he refused to serve in World War I and was therefore could not return to Belgium after the war. Instead, he settled in Paris and Switzerland, and from 1917 to 1920 worked as a political cartoonist for the newspaper Feuille. He was an excellent draftsman with an eye for naturalism, but due to the low quality of newspaper printing and the quick work turnover, he would create bold black and white images with block shapes and thick lines. He used brushes and India ink for this, but it later informed his woodblock style. It also allowed him to express and develop his political views, particularly anti-war and socialist sentiments. In 1919, he helped found and worked on Belgian magazine Lumière, along with illustrators Joseph Canche, Jan Frans Canche, Henry van Straten, and Joris Min, known as De Vijf or The Five. An artistic and literary journal, it first focused on artistic trends like expressionism and plastic art, later specializing into expressionist wood engravings. Together, the five generated interest in wood, copper, and lino engraving, and introduced expressionism to early 20th century Belgium. You can see in their work that they were all heavily influenced by expressionism. Expressionism, this is in visual art, it's a movement that began in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century as a response to artistic styles such as naturalism and impressionism, these styles which seek to accurately portray the world as it is. Expressionism instead presents the world from a subjective perspective, expressing moods or emotions by distorting reality. It is characterized by simplified shapes and gestural marks, which lent themselves well to woodcuts, a favorite technique of the German expressionists. Expressionism was focused on the future, on making progress, and thus lent itself well to addressing post-war political challenges. Though he didn't refer to his work as expressionist, this movement informed Masereel's woodcut strongly, allowing him to portray human experience in an honest, emotional way and use his art to comment on socio-political issues. Masereel's first woodcut novel, regarded as the first woodcut novel ever, was published in 1918, titled 25 Images of a Man's Passion. It chronicles a young working-class man's journey to leading a revolt against his employer, only to be executed. In addition to defining socialist themes such as the struggle against oppression and the martyrdom of the working class, which would continue throughout his oeuvre, this novel also features much religious imagery. The common man takes the place of Jesus, with crucifix imagery and even the name suggesting the story of Christ. This is because Masereel was very inspired by medieval woodcuts. The first woodcuts produced in Europe occurred around the year 1400, though the technique had been around in Asia for over 1,000 years before that. But this technique was well suited to reproduction, so it was featured in some of the earliest mass-produced books and therefore co-opted for use in printed Bibles. It is these religious woodcuts that Masereel was inspired by, so he used the language of religious woodcuts to make political statements about the strife of the common people instead of to tell stories about Christ. So Masereel's next wordless novel was published in 1919 and is considered by many to be his masterpiece. This is the one that I have actually read in full, and it is fucking weird. Here's a quick story. So, after arriving in the city and just observing what's going on, this young man gets laid, becomes an upstanding citizen, falls in love with a hooker, steals a child, which he then raises as his own daughter, who then promptly dies, which drives him insane and causes him to act out like a lunatic until he dies in the forest and his spirit stomps on his heart. I don't really get the message of it, whether it's like satirical or allegorical, but it sure is fun to read. What is impressive is the strength of emotional engagement Masereel achieves through just shapes of black and white. In this sense, it relates more to the skill of cartooning, collapsing characters and expressions into recognizable shapes which, over simple sequences of images and scenes, evoke strong emotions. This wouldn't be achieved to the same degree with single images, or even images accompanied by words, therefore exemplifying the power of the wordless or graphic novel when done well. What really struck me is the way that Masereel composes his pages. It can be difficult to distinguish characters and elements in the crude black and white shapes, so Masereel finds ways of guiding the eye around the scene using placement and guiding elements such as cobblestones, arms or legs, buildings, and bright sources of light. Ooh. So, Masereel's wordless novels, of which he published 44 up till his death, were widely popular throughout Europe. I think this is partly due to the public's growing preoccupation with pictorial media in the early 20th century, particularly with cartoons and silent cinema. Another factor in their popularity was the introductions to the published books, written by prominent and influential authors such as Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, and Hermann Hesse, whose work often featured similar symbolism and social criticism. He also painted. Don't really know what to say about this. It's nice, I guess. Not that interested to be honest. What is interesting is who he has then gone on to influence. So he has influenced many printmakers, including contemporary print artists such as Sue Coe, who has cited Masereel as an influence, and the sociological backbone of his work can also be seen in the woodcuts of German-Israeli artist Jakob Pins. Masereel's influence on a century of woodcuts and wood engravings can also be keenly felt, particularly in the trend of woodcut novels or novels in pictures. The 1930s woodcut novels of Lind Ward, on the left and in the middle, which were also another strong influence on the modern graphic novel, owe much to the form and style of Masereel, as do more recent examples such as Eric Dricker's Flood and George A. Walker's version of Passionate Journey, which chronicles the day of 9/11 in New York. But Masereel's influence runs deeper, not just in printmaking, but also sequential art. In the level of craft and fine art leanings, his novels were easier for the public to accept and to enjoy than common comics that were perhaps derived from cartoons. It seems natural now to refer to Masereel as a graphic novelist, despite that term only being coined in 1978. But generations have looked to Masereel's work to inform their own comics practice, notably Art Spiegelman, who explicitly refers to Masereel as his earliest source of inspiration. I've found no proper proof, that Will Eisner, the grandmaster of comics, was influenced by Masereel, but I think you can tell in the art that Eisner was not just drawing from the other strip cartoons of the age, and Masereel's harsh blacks and block shapes lend themselves well to the noir comics that Eisner was producing in the 40s. Eisner and Spiegelman's work has in turn been immensely influential in comics. Side note, the term graphic novel is bullshit, and I will die on this hill, but I'm using it here to distinguish a comics practice focused on non-serialized comics published in book form, as opposed to commercial and underground periodicals or zines. I will now attempt to argue that his work has gone on to influence a century of comics. Not only did it serve as inspiration to the likes of Ward, Spiegelman, and Eisner, but the woodblock aesthetic lent itself well to the method of printing comics in the mid to late 20th century. Crude mass printing onto newsprint paper meant details and art were lost easily, so stark, thick lines and shadows were favoured. Additionally, grey tones and particularly colours were difficult and expensive to achieve, so comics grew up in the mould of Masereel, from David Lloyd's deep shadows in V for Vendetta to the energetic shapes in pulp and underground comics such as 2000 AD. Masereel is even explicitly referenced in Jason Lute's acclaimed Berlin series. You can see a page from Passionate Journey on the right in the comic, which acknowledges both the creative and political influence of his work. Masereel liked the roughness of woodcut. He felt it was fitting for portraying the passions of the common man. The means of making a woodcut not only reflect the democratic attitude that Masereel held for all people, but also that the actual materials are linked directly to nature. However, as opposed to the static, blocky medium of woodcut, Masereel's work is kinetic and atmospheric, even though many of the images disregard light and shadow in favour of flat, legible shapes. I would like to highlight one more of Masereel's woodcut novels, this time not a narrative, but more a series of snapshots of life in the city. Masereel's frame follows denizens of the city through their day-to-day lives, acting as voyeur and inducing the viewer to do the same. Once again, he exhibits his skill in evocative storytelling that here requires no tangible narrative, yet still succeeds in telling a story. Not the story of one man, but of a whole city of people. One final descendant of Masereel here, the graphic adaptation of Paul Auster's City of Glass, drawn by David Mazzucchelli. In woodblock-style ink lines and experimental panel structure and imagery, Mazzucchelli takes us on a psychogeographic journey through the city of New York. He evokes similar atmospheres and emotions of loneliness and anonymity to Masereel, with his shared use of expressionistic and surreal imagery to convey the metaphysical elements of the prose novel. In these similarities, I argue that Frans Masereel, ancestor of modern comics, is still influencing work a century later, right at the frontier of experimental comics. God, do I love this guy. Thank you for listening.
Stop the audio.
Oh, shit, it's still